He has jumped out of planes at 30,000 feet, scaled the tallest building on Earth, and ridden a motorcycle off a cliff on purpose. He has also become the subject of one of the most replayed video clips in television history and the center of a leaked recording that made headlines around the world. Some of these stories he has told himself, in his own words, during interviews, most fans never fully connected into a single narrative. Others were caught entirely on camera, whether he wanted them to be or not. Here are 10 unbelievable Tom Cruise stories. Number 10. The actor who actually learned to fly. Long before Tom Cruise became known for climbing buildings and jumping out of aircraft, established as one of the defining action stars of his generation, largely on the strength of stunts most other performers would never consider attempting themselves, he became a licensed private pilot, earning his certification in the early 1990s after developing a fascination with aviation while filming 1986's Top Gun, a role that first put him in close contact with active Navy fighter pilots and their aircraft. What started as research for a role gradually became a genuine, lifelong pursuit, and Cruise has continued adding aircraft ratings and qualifications to his license for more than 3 decades since, eventually becoming certified to fly a wide range of aircraft well beyond the small propeller planes most private pilots typically operate. By the time production began on 2022's Top Gun, Maverick, Cruise personally owned and piloted a P-51 Mustang, a World War II-era fighter plane that once served as one of the most advanced aircraft of its era, footage of which appears in the finished film during scenes depicting his character's civilian flying. The United States Navy, which partnered closely with the production and allowed extensive access to its F/A-18 Super Hornets, did not permit Cruise himself to take the controls of one of the jets during filming, citing the extreme cost and specialized certification required to operate active military aircraft, even for a pilot as experienced as Cruise had become, along with concerns about liability, given how much of the film's budget the aircraft themselves represented. Cruise has said in interviews that flying functions as something close to meditation for him, a way of clearing his mind between projects, and he has continued to pilot himself to premieres, press events, and even some film sets over the years, rather than relying on commercial travel, a habit that has occasionally made headlines of its own when Cruise has landed his own aircraft directly at remote filming locations. He has also said that his flying license factored directly into how Paramount and the film's insurers approached several of his most demanding aerial stunts, since his genuine piloting background gave production teams a higher baseline level of confidence in his spatial awareness and composure inside an aircraft compared to an actor with no flying experience at all. That same instinct for total immersion, of insisting on genuinely learning a skill rather than faking it for the camera, traces back to a childhood defined by constant upheaval, one that looked almost nothing like the confident, controlled public figure audiences would eventually come to know decades later on movie posters and late-night couches alike. Number 9. A childhood spent starting over. Thomas Cruise. Mapother IV was born in Syracuse, New York, in 1962, the third of 4 children and the only son, and by his own account, moved more than a dozen times during his childhood, as his family relocated repeatedly across the United States and Canada, following his father's various engineering jobs from one short-term position to the next. Cruise has described the constant relocation as forcing him to repeatedly rebuild his social life from nothing, arriving at a new school every year or two with no existing friendships and having to establish himself all over again each time. A pattern he has said made him unusually adept at reading new environments and people quickly, a skill he has credited with later helping him navigate the unfamiliar and high-pressure world of professional acting. Cruise has also spoken publicly about being diagnosed with dyslexia as a child, a learning difference that made traditional schoolwork exceptionally difficult for him during a period before the condition was widely understood or accommodated in most classrooms, meaning teachers and classmates often assumed he was simply struggling or unmotivated rather than dealing with an unaddressed learning disability. He has described struggling to keep pace with reading assignments throughout his early education, a challenge that he has said shaped his approach to preparing for film roles later in life, relying heavily on repetition, physical practice, and hands-on learning rather than solely on script analysis, a method that some directors have credited with contributing directly to the physical commitment he brings to stunt work decades later. Cruise's parents divorced when he was 11, and he has spoken about his relationship with his father, Thomas Mapother III, in largely negative terms in later interviews. describing him as a bully who moved the family constantly and whose departure from the household ultimately came as a relief rather than a loss, a rare instance of Cruise offering pointed criticism of a family member in the press. In a 2006 interview, Cruise elaborated further, saying his father had a certain kind of anger that made him frightened as a child, and that discovering acting later became, in part, a way of channeling emotions he had never felt safe expressing openly during that period of his life. Cruise has credited his mother, Mary Lee, and his 3 older sisters with providing the stability that allowed him to eventually pursue acting, a path he committed to as a teenager after a brief attempt at competitive wrestling was cut short by a knee injury that ended his athletic ambitions and redirected him toward a school drama production instead. That same willingness to commit completely to something physically demanding, regardless of the risk involved, would go on to define an entire era of his film career, beginning with a single stunt that quite literally stopped production in its tracks. Number 8. The jump that broke his ankle. During production of 2018's Mission Impossible Fallout, the 6th installment in a franchise that had grown steadily more physically demanding with each new entry, Cruise was filming a rooftop chase sequence in London that required his character to leap from one building to another, a stunt Cruise performed himself rather than using a stunt double, in keeping with his long-standing approach to the franchise. On the 3rd attempt at the jump, Cruise fell short of the landing and struck the wall of the adjacent building, twisting and breaking his ankle on impact, an injury caught on tethered safety camera footage that later leaked publicly and spread rapidly online before the studio had even confirmed the extent of the injury. Rather than immediately calling for medical attention, Cruise pulled himself up over the ledge and continued moving past the camera to complete the shot, later explaining on the Graham Norton show that he knew the ankle was broken the moment it happened but did not want to ruin the take after everyone had worked so hard to set it up, describing the specific sensation of his foot landing at an unnatural angle against the wall. Production was halted for roughly 3 months while Cruise underwent surgery and rehabilitation, a delay Paramount Pictures confirmed publicly at the time, though the film still made its original release date the following July. Cruise later revealed that he continued filming other sequences while the ankle was still healing, describing a rehabilitation schedule of 8 to 10 hours per day, 7 days a week, alongside ongoing production demands, and joking in interviews that he simply did not have the option of falling behind schedule given how much of the film's marketing had already been built around a fixed release date. The footage of the injury itself, including the moment of impact captured from multiple camera angles, was eventually shown publicly by Cruise himself during a television appearance, a choice that turned what could have been a private medical setback into one of the most widely discussed behind-the-scenes stories of the entire franchise, and one he has continued to reference with self-deprecating humor in interviews for years since, at one point joking to a late-night host that the injury was, by his own standards, one of the easier mishaps of his stunt career. That injury, dramatic as it was far from the most dangerous stunt Cruise performed during that same production. Just months later, he was hanging outside the door of a military aircraft, preparing to fall from an altitude most passenger jets do not even reach, a sequence that had never before been attempted for a mainstream studio film in quite the same way. Number 7. Climbing the tallest building on Earth. For 2011's Mission Impossible Ghost Protocol, a film many industry observers at the time assumed would mark Cruise's final outing in the franchise given its uncertain box office prospects, after the underwhelming reception of the previous installment, director Brad Bird wanted a signature action sequence set against the world's tallest building, Dubai's Burj Khalifa, which stands 2,722 feet tall and had only recently opened to the public at the time filming began. Rather than relying on visual effects or a stunt double to sell the sequence, Cruise insisted on performing the exterior climb himself, scaling the building's glass facade using specialized suction gloves while attached only to a safety harness anchored inside, a piece of equipment the production had to design and test extensively before it could be trusted with an actor's life at that height. Cruise ultimately worked at a height of approximately 1,700 feet, roughly level with the building's 123rd to 130th floors. A height stunt coordinator, Greg Smars, later said, had never been attempted before, and would likely never be allowed again, given the building owner's initial reluctance to permit any filming on the exterior at all. Smars has recalled telling director Brad Bird outright that the plan involved climbing 1,700 feet into the air on the outside of a building, a scale of risk that required weeks of negotiation just to secure permission before any physical preparation could even begin. The production team removed 17 glass panels from unused floors to create points for rigging and camera access, working carefully to avoid any permanent damage to the structure in order to maintain the relationship they had built with the building's owners during negotiations, a relationship complicated further by one particular building representative, whom the crew nicknamed Dr. No for his habitual refusal of nearly every request they made. Brad Bird later recalled asking his stunt coordinator directly whether he understood the scale of what they were attempting, given that the crew was suspending one of the most valuable actors in the world nearly 200 feet above the ground on the side of an active skyscraper in the middle of a major city, with cars and pedestrians visibly reflected in the building's windows throughout several of the finished shots. The resulting sequence, which runs for roughly 8 minutes of screen time, is still frequently cited by critics and film historians as one of the most technically accomplished practical stunts ever captured on camera. And building management in Dubai has since noted a lasting increase in tourist interest tied directly to the film's release, with the sequence functioning as an unofficial advertisement for the tower itself in the years since. Impressive as the Burj Khalifa climb was, it did not even rank as the most physically extreme stunt Cruise would attempt for that same franchise. 7 years later, he would step out of a moving aircraft at an altitude where the air itself becomes too thin to breathe without assistance, a sequence that pushed the entire production's safety planning to its absolute limit. Number 6. Falling from 6 miles up. For Fallout's climactic sequence, filmed the same year Cruise had already broken his ankle earlier in production, Cruise and director Christopher McQuarrie wanted to depict a genuine high-altitude, low-opening jump, a specialized military parachuting technique that involves an extended freefall from extreme altitude before deploying a parachute much closer to the ground, a maneuver typically reserved for special operations forces rather than civilian skydivers. Rather than simulate the sequence, Cruise trained for over a year to perform the jump himself, ultimately leaping from a C-17 military transport plane at altitudes between 25,000 and 30,000 feet, roughly 5 to 6 miles above the ground, reaching speeds of up to 220 miles per hour during the descent and requiring supplemental oxygen simply to remain conscious at that altitude. The production's technical demands compounded the difficulty considerably. Filmmakers needed footage that clearly showed Cruise's face during the fall, which meant standard skydiving oxygen equipment, designed to obscure as little of a jumper's field of vision as possible rather than their face, would not work for the shot. The team developed a custom oxygen mask specifically to keep Cruise's face visible and properly lit throughout the jump, solving a problem that had never previously needed solving for any film production attempting a similar sequence, and trained a camera operator to wear a specialized helmet rig, exit the aircraft just ahead of Cruise, and fall backward in order to keep the shot in frame throughout the entire descent, a role that itself required the camera operator to become nearly as skilled a skydiver as Cruise had become. Between training and the actual shoot, Cruise completed the jump a total of 106 times in order to capture the 3 usable takes that made it into the finished film. A scale of repetition McQuarrie has said was necessary, specifically because the production refused to rely on any digital substitute for the sequence, insisting that every frame audiences saw needed to represent something that had genuinely happened in front of the camera. Cruise performed the jump only months after breaking his ankle during the same production, continuing his recovery routine between takes on set in order to keep the shoot on schedule, a detail that made the sequence's difficulty even more remarkable to those working alongside him at the time, several of whom later said in interviews that they were astonished he was cleared to attempt anything so physically demanding so soon after major surgery. As extreme as the halo jump was, Cruise would go on to describe an entirely different stunt, attempted years later for the same franchise, as the single most dangerous thing he had ever done in his career, one that combined 2 separate extreme sports into a single unbroken sequence for the very first time in his filmography. Number 5. The motorcycle jump he'd dreamed of since childhood. For 2023's Mission Impossible: Dead Reckoning. Part 1, billed at the time as one of 2 connected films meant to close out Cruise's run as Ethan Hunt, Cruise set out to perform a stunt combining 2 skills he had never previously attempted together: riding a motorcycle off a cliff, and transitioning immediately into a base jump, deploying a parachute at a dangerously low altitude relative to the ground below, a maneuver so risky it is rarely attempted even by professional stunt performers, let alone a leading actor also responsible for delivering dialogue and staying in character throughout. Cruise has said publicly that he had wanted to attempt exactly this stunt since he was a child, and that the film's production finally gave him both the resources and the justification to make it happen after decades of the idea sitting in the back of his mind. Preparation for the sequence, filmed on a Norwegian mountainside chosen specifically for its dramatic vistas and suitable cliff geometry, took over a year and involved 2 entirely separate training regimens running in parallel. Cruise completed more than 500 individual skydives to refresh and sharpen his parachuting skills, including canopy control and tracking technique, while simultaneously logging over 13,000 practice jumps on a specially built motocross bike, constructed from a modified Honda frame by stunt vehicle specialist Kieran Clark, to master the exact speed and body position needed to launch safely off the custom ramp constructed for the stunt. Engineers built detailed computer simulations to predict Cruise's trajectory through the air before he ever attempted the jump for real, modeling how variables like wind speed and separation timing from the motorcycle could affect the outcome, and stunt coordinator Wade Eastwood has said the entire plan was built specifically around avoiding 2 outcomes: a fatal collision with the mountainside or a fatally tangled parachute line that could send Cruise directly into the rock face below. On the day of filming, Cruise completed the full motorcycle to base jump sequence 6 separate times, a number the production considered remarkable given how little margin for error the stunt allowed on each individual attempt, and Cruise reportedly practiced the jump once more from a hovering helicopter before ever attempting the full motorcycle version for the cameras. Christopher McQuarrie, who has directed Cruise through several of the franchise's most extreme sequences, called this particular stunt, without qualification, the most dangerous thing the production had ever attempted, a distinction notable given everything Cruise had already survived in the franchise's previous 6 installments. And one base jumping coach, Miles Daisher, who consulted on the stunt, echoed by noting bluntly that the only real goals on a jump of that kind are avoiding serious injury or worse. That same commitment to total authenticity did not stop with stunts Cruise performed alone. For his next major project, he required an entire ensemble cast to undergo military-level training before a single frame of dialogue was filmed, turning a group of working actors into functionally qualified aviators over the course of a single production schedule. Number 4, he made the whole cast learn to fly. Cruise agreed to reprise his role as Pete Maverick Mitchell for 2022's Top Gun. Maverick, more than 3 decades after the original film had helped launch him into international stardom, on one specific condition, one he has said he communicated directly to producer Jerry Bruckheimer before signing on. The aerial sequences would be filmed using real aircraft rather than computer-generated effects, with actors genuinely present inside the cockpits during flight, a standard Cruise insisted on despite the significantly greater cost, logistical complexity, and physical risk involved compared to relying on visual effects. Achieving that meant every cast member playing a pilot needed to be physically and mentally prepared to withstand real gravitational forces while delivering dialogue and operating camera equipment thousands of feet in the air, a level of preparation far beyond what most film productions would ever ask of their actors. Cruise personally designed the resulting training program, which stretched across roughly 3 months and progressed the actors gradually from smaller aircraft up to the Navy's F/A-18 Super Hornets. Actors including Miles Teller, Glenn Powell, and Monica Barbaro began in a Cessna 172 to learn basic flight fundamentals, advanced to an aerobatic Extra 330 stunt plane to build tolerance for sustained G-forces, and eventually flew in the F/A-18S themselves, seated behind active-duty Navy pilots while operating specialized IMAX-quality cameras mounted inside the cockpit, a task that required them to essentially serve as their own camera operators mid-flight while a trained pilot handled the actual aircraft. Cruise reviewed daily performance reports on each actor's progress throughout the program, and cast members have since described him personally checking in on individuals who struggled with specific maneuvers during earlier flights, with actor Danny Ramirez recalling that the cast initially assumed no one was actually reading their daily submitted forms until Cruise began referencing specific details from them directly in conversation. Despite designing the entire program and having decades of flight experience himself, Cruise was not permitted to personally operate the controls of the Navy's fighter jets during filming, a restriction tied to insurance requirements and the extraordinary cost of the aircraft, which alone represented roughly half the film's total production budget, meaning even the film's own producer and star had to defer to active-duty military pilots for that particular piece of authenticity, a limitation Cruise has said he accepted without complaint, given how much the Navy's cooperation had already made possible for the rest of the production. That same intensity, applied without hesitation to a Hollywood production, would surface again under far less celebratory circumstances just 2 years later, when a very different kind of recording made its way into the public eye and revealed a considerably less flattering side of the same demanding perfectionism. Number 3, the leaked recording heard around the world. In December 2020, during production of Mission Impossible 7 in the United Kingdom, at a time when film sets around the world were operating under some of the strictest safety protocols the industry had ever seen, a recording surfaced showing Cruise angrily confronting members of his own crew after spotting 2 people standing too close together in violation of pandemic-era safety protocols, at a moment when film and television productions across the world were struggling to stay operational under constantly shifting public health restrictions. The audio, first obtained and published by the British tabloid The Sun, ran for roughly 3.5 minutes and was later confirmed as authentic by multiple outlets, citing sources close to the production, including Variety and Reuters. In the recording, a visibly furious Cruise can be heard telling the crew that their production had become the standard the rest of the film industry was depending on to prove that filming could safely continue during the pandemic, warning that any further violations would result in immediate termination, regardless of the individual's role on set. He described being in constant contact with studios and insurers who were watching the production closely and argued that a shutdown would cost ordinary crew members their livelihoods at a moment when much of the entertainment industry remained frozen, pointing out that the consequences of careless behavior would extend far beyond the 2 individuals he was directly addressing. The recording spread rapidly across entertainment and general news coverage, with reactions split between those who felt Cruise's anger was an understandable response to the genuine stakes involved in keeping a major production running safely during an unprecedented global health crisis, and others who felt the tone and language crossed well beyond what any reasonable workplace correction required, regardless of the underlying justification. Cruise addressed the incident directly in a later interview with Empire magazine, saying simply that he stood by what he had said, given how much was genuinely at risk at that point in the pandemic, and noting that the production was never shut down again for the remainder of the shoot, framing the entire exchange as an emotional but necessary moment rather than something he felt any need to walk back publicly. That same year, and for many years both before and after it, an entirely different subject connected to Cruise's personal life continued generating some of the most persistent and polarizing coverage of his entire career, one rooted not in a single incident, but in a decades-long, deeply public commitment. Number 2, the leaked video that became a meme. Tom Cruise has been a publicly devoted member of the Church of Scientology since joining in 1990, a relationship that has remained one of the most consistently discussed aspects of his public life across more than 3 decades, becoming over the following decades one of the organization's most prominent and visible spokespeople, a status that has occasionally drawn scrutiny to the organization itself, given how closely its public image has become tied to Cruise's own celebrity. In January 2008, a 9-minute promotional video featuring Cruise, originally produced for an internal Scientology awards ceremony where he was being honored with the organization's Freedom Medal, was leaked onto the internet, quickly spreading across blogs and video platforms before the church could act to remove it. In the footage, Cruise appears in a black turtleneck, alternating between intense, unbroken eye contact with the camera and bursts of prolonged, unrestrained laughter, describing Scientologists using internal terminology largely unfamiliar to general audiences and making expansive claims about the organization's ability to help people overcome addiction and rehabilitate criminal behavior, at one point suggesting that Scientologists are the only people equipped to properly assist someone at the scene of a car accident. the Church of Scientology moved aggressively to have the video removed from YouTube and other platforms, an effort that backfired considerably, drawing far more attention to the footage than it likely would have received otherwise, and directly inspiring an organized online movement calling itself Project Chanology, which staged real-world protests outside church properties in cities around the world throughout 2008, with participants frequently wearing the now iconic Guy Fawkes masks associated with the online collective Anonymous. Clips and remixes of Cruz's laughter from the video continued circulating online for years afterward, eventually becoming one of the earliest widely recognized viral meme formats on the internet, repurposed and referenced in entirely unrelated contexts, long after most viewers had forgotten the footage's original context, appearing in remix videos with millions of combined views across multiple platforms. Cruz has continued to be closely associated with Scientology in the years since, though he has generally declined to discuss the specifics of his beliefs or practices in most mainstream media interviews, typically redirecting such questions back toward whatever film he happens to be promoting at the time. None of these stories, however, come close to matching the sheer scale of public reaction generated by a single television appearance 3 years earlier, one that instantly became one of the most replayed and referenced pieces of footage in the history of daytime talk shows, and that continues shaping how Cruz's public persona is understood to this day. Number 1. The couch jump. On May 23, 2005, near the peak of his box office drawing power and roughly 2 decades into a career already defined by remarkable career longevity, Cruz appeared on The Oprah Winfrey Show to promote his upcoming film, War of the Worlds, roughly 1 month after he had begun publicly dating actress Katie Holmes, who had recently ended an engagement to actor Chris Klein, just weeks before meeting Cruz. What followed became one of the most widely replayed pieces of celebrity footage of the decade. As Oprah Winfrey pressed him about his new relationship, Cruz grew increasingly animated, dropping to one knee repeatedly, grabbing Winfrey's hands and shaking them, and eventually climbing directly onto her studio couch, arms raised, while the audience erupted into screams loud enough that producers later said the reaction genuinely startled the studio crew. Contrary to how the moment is often remembered, Cruz did not bounce up and down on the couch cushions as popular memory has exaggerated over the years. He jumped onto the couch itself and remained standing there for a moment before continuing the interview, a small but frequently misremembered detail that has nonetheless done little to diminish how the moment lives on in popular culture. The distinction mattered little to the public reaction that followed. Within days, the clip was being replayed constantly across entertainment news programs, and it quickly became shorthand across popular culture for a celebrity appearing to have lost control of his own composure in real time, on camera, with nowhere to hide, inspiring parody sketches, magazine covers, and eventually a wave of novelty t-shirts referencing the moment directly. Cruz and Holmes announced their engagement less than a month later, married in November 2006, and had a daughter, Suri, born earlier that same year. The marriage ended in divorce in 2012, a split reportedly planned quietly by Holmes' legal team, before the announcement to avoid the kind of prolonged, unpredictable public battle their relationship had so often generated in the press, with the divorce itself finalized within a matter of weeks, a stark contrast to how publicly the relationship's early days had once played out. Nearly 2 decades later, the couch jump remains one of the defining images of Cruz's public life. A single, unscripted moment that continues to resurface in retrospectives, comedy sketches, and internet culture long after most of the film he had actually been there to promote has faded from memory, standing today as perhaps the clearest example of how a few unguarded seconds on live television can outlast decades of carefully managed publicity. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more history documentaries.